As another reminder to everybody, this meeting of the Oversight Committee is open to the public, and at the end, we do have a 2-minute public comment period. So while throughout the meeting, members of the Oversight Committee will be able to ask questions and provide input, I would ask everyone in the public to wait till the end when we get to that point of the agenda, and you will have your opportunity to speak on items we're presenting. So we're going to go ahead. I'm going to pull up the agenda and we will get our meeting started. So we've officially called the meeting of the Oversight Committee to order. The next item on our agenda is communications. And I just have a very brief update on communications for today. And that is to let everybody know that on our main website for the MRC Oversight Committee, and if Kayla or Sam can drop that website in the chat, I'd appreciate it. It's the cchealth.org/hazmat/MRC. We now have now have availability for members of the public to sign up via email for updates on the Oversight Committee work and MRC updates that we may have. I see that that's been put there in the chat. Thank you very much, Sam. So just so everybody knows and is aware, if you would like to receive email updates from Contra Costa Health on this matter, please visit that webpage and sign up. Great. I didn't have any further communications updates, so now I'm going to move over to what I'm calling our open issues, which is the review of the work done to date. Then we'll move to the new business, which is the status of the soil sampling and update. Then we will go to public comment period and end with the roundtable. So I want to start with a review of work done on the incident investigation side. I'd like to just provide a brief update that Scott Berger and Associates has finalized their contract with the county, and they are able to start work on the incident investigation. We will be able to provide more updates as that continues to go through our Oversight Committee process. Secondly, I want to talk about the work that has been done since our last meeting. Since we last met in April, we've actually had a lot of work being done on the community risk assessment. So I know there was some confusion last time as to what the community risk assessment, moving forward was going to be doing in terms of soil sampling. And so I want to clear up any confusion on that. When the Oversight Committee ended their meeting on the 27th, we were putting forward a vote on adding additional locations to the 12 that were originally identified by TRC. At the end of that discussion, what the committee members were voting on was if they wanted to vote to add additional sites either at what was known as MRC 1 from the map or additional sites in the area between MRC 1 and 5. There was concern that there was an area that was not covered. At the end of that voting, what was voted on by the majority vote of the Oversight Committee members was to add additional soil testing and sampling locations in the area between Martinez 1 and 5. So I'd like to take the opportunity now to show the testing locations that TRC pulled soil sampling from. Okay, so right here, I have a map showing the soil sampling locations. You can see each of them are labeled MRC 1 through 12. These are the exact latitude and longitudes that TRC pulled the soils samples from. I want to talk more about the added locations, which are points MRC 13 and MRC 14. During the discussion the Oversight Committee had, there was some concern that we had not addressed the area near the Las Juntas Elementary School. This green icon here is the location of Las Juntas Elementary. The additional MRC 14 location actually was quite close to MRC 14. I'm going to turn it over to Adam Springer in just a minute to really talk in detail about the soil sampling, but I wanted to bring this to everyone's attention as to where exactly that point landed. The other additional point, MRC 13, as you can see, does lie between MRC 1 and 5 and address concerns that we did not have enough soil sampling locations near the downtown Martinez area, very close to the refinery where the greatest deposition would have occurred. The Oversight Committee, after taking that vote, had agreed to add those 2 locations. And then the week of May 1st, specifically on May 4th and May 5th, TRC, along with Contra Costa Health, as an escort, went out and performed the soil sampling. And that's really what we want to provide an update on today. So I'm going to turn it over to Adam Springer, who was on site that day, to talk a little bit about how the sampling locations were chosen and the work that occurred out on the field. So Adam.
Thanks, Nicole. So we went about choosing these locations to take at an approximate location according to the design sampling plan of TRC. During the field walk, we looked at public land versus private for liability concerns to property owners. So we chose not to do, if possible, we'd like to do public land versus private. So that was our first goal. The goal was to choose a location most likely to be impacted at each location. So once we arrived on the site, we would take a look at the overall area to make sure that it was appropriate that would be actually impacted, the worst case impact for that area. For example, if that big large dot fell on a, close to a large hill, and we would want to be on the hillside closest to MRC and not on the hillside away from MRC, because that would get less impact. So we chose the most impacted area. Also, simple examples are, we didn't sample in locations that there were a lot of trees that may have changed the characteristics of the plume that was coming down or the catalyst release. We want to make sure there was a pretty open area and to make sure that we avoided any tree coverage. Several locations had to be moved in the general similar area as far as the Bay Area Air Quality Management District model. If we did have to move the location, we made sure to make sure that that location, if it did change, was in the same color or deposition of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District model. So basically the same color if you saw it on that map with their color for the grams per meter cubed of coverage for that modeling. CCH deferred to the project geologists on site when we were doing the sampling event. We took a TRC to a general location, and we talked about what the best location with the project geologist on site, and then collected the sample after that. TRC project geologist did that. I'm welcome to answer any questions that may have been brought up by how we did that sampling.
I did have one question, Adam. So in terms of when you went to the locations and we're determining that sample sites, did location next to a road come into consideration? And what about just the soil composition itself?
So we tried not to get samples that are directly close to the road, because you do have a lot of materials that are being impacted just by road metals from, brake dust, vehicle traffic, tire dust. You have a lot of different types of materials that are being deposited by roadways in general. So it was best to take a sample that was not as impacted by roads. For example, parks, we did a couple parks, open spaces. We were in East Bay Regional Park Districts, East Bay Mud property, that kind of locations that wouldn't have any cross sensitivities from any outside type of impacts.
Great. And before I open it up to questions or comments from the Oversight Committee members, I'm wondering too, Adam, if you can just shed some light for us on kind of what the day looked like for that sample. So after the geologist collected the sample in the glass jar, what happened, with that glass jar?
That was under chain of custody. So the project geologist would record the exact location. That's how we got all these specific locations. The sample would be collected, sealed, identified, labeled, and then put under basically in a cooler to keep it cool for transport. And about halfway through the project, due to holding times, you can't hold these samples for too long. About halfway during this project, during the day, the courier for the lab actually came and met us en route to different locations to grab those samples and bring them directly to the lab so they can put them in the cooler of the lab.
And all of that follows general standard practice and
Yes.
procedures for soil sample collection.
Correct.
Great. And then just also to confirm, this soil sampling took place over 2 days. So May 4th and then May 5th to capture the last spots in Solano County, correct?
Yeah, there was a lot of area to cover, as you see, and especially a lot of rural area, a lot of driving that day. We coordinated with Solano County because we didn't want to have to impact them too much, and we're able to coordinate a specific time. We could do that on that Friday to coordinate the last 2 samples in Solano County.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Okay, I will now open it up to questions and comments from the Oversight Committee. And I see that Cheryl has her hand raised. So go ahead, Cheryl.
Hi, thank you. And thanks for this report. I was just wondering, out of curiosity, because of runoff on hillsides and things like that, would it be better to take test soil samples from flat areas than hillsides?
Exactly. And that's exactly what we did.
Thank you.
Tom?
Yeah, so I have a question about the depth of the samples, especially given the rains that occurred between the incident and the sampling. So what is the motivation for taking samples to a depth of six inches as opposed to making them deeper, say 12 inches?
I think TRC would be the best people to answer that question, but from
Yeah.
what
We
they
have
said,
TRC online, Adam, so perhaps
Do we?
Kayla
Yeah.
can promote Jonathan to panelist
perfect.
right now, and they can address that, or if Laura is online as well. So Kayla, can we bring up Laura Trozzolo and Jonathan?
Sure, they're both
Thank
coming
you.
right now.
And then I do see that a member of the audience has their hand raised. Just as a reminder, we will do public comment period at the end of the meeting. So I see your hand raised. I'm not ignoring you, I promise. Okay, great. So we have TRC online. So I don't know, Jonathan or Laura, if one of you can address that question, please, about the soil sampling depth.
Certainly. No, this is Jonathan Shiner. We, as Adam pointed out, we, were endeavoring to collect samples from relatively flat areas versus those sloping, precisely because of the concern that was raised in your question about rains and potential runoff, transporting potential presence of catalyst dust away from the area. So with that in mind, the flat areas were selected, and then B, the likelihood of vertical transport through the soil column of these dust particles much beyond 6 inches, we deem to be unlikely in these flat areas. We're not talking about transporting highly soluble tiny particles as much as particulates in the dust, and mechanically through the soil column, 6 inches to 12 inches, the upper 6 inches was deemed the most appropriate. Also, I would point out that, we did not, if we collect deeper samples, we may be missing what's still present in the shallow soil. And so we certainly, again, I want to emphasize that this is a worst case scenario type thing. We're trying to get, we're trying not to get a necessarily representative picture. We're trying to get the worst case. So we're going to where we think the dust is most likely to still be present. And that includes not only these lateral considerations, but also vertically within the soil column.
Thank you, Jonathan. Do I have any other questions or comments from Oversight Committee members? Okay, I am not seeing any hands raised from Oversight Committee members. So I want to talk a little bit now about, what happened next. So the soil sampling took place on May 4th and May 5th. And per the soil sampling work plan that TRC provided us, and as Adam had described, the soil samples were picked up and taken to the lab. The lab was given an order to run their analysis on an expedited timeframe, which was set at 5 days. Per my conversations with TRC, I know that they have received initial analysis results back from the lab. They are still undergoing their quality control, quality assurance process, which is really to, review that laboratory information and ensure that there's nothing that occurred to the samples that could have caused a error in what was being reported back. There is an internal process that they're going to use. Then now after that, we're really going to be focusing, or I should say TRC is really going to be focusing on the part that's going to be able to provide the answers to the community. And that is that community risk assessment. So taking that data and being able to interpret it and run it and compare against screening levels that have been established by EPA and other sources. And just as a reminder, through this laboratory analysis, we were really looking at those metals that were we feel, are commonly, I shouldn't say we feel, we are looking at those metals that are commonly found in spent catalysts, and that includes aluminum, it includes chromium, and the work plan by TRC was taking a look at hexavalent chromium as well, looking at the amount of vanadium and nickel and other metals, through that analysis, aluminum. So we're really focusing on what would be expected from this November 24th, 25th release. Then as TRC computes their risk assessment, they're going to be able to speak to those health and ecological effects. And that part is the part that we have been saying, we expect to have results by late May, early June. And when we get to that point, we will definitely have another oversight committee meeting to talk about that. But before we kind of move on, I wanted to turn it over to our Deputy Director, Matt Kaufman, to talk a little bit more about the risk assessment piece and kind of what happens next. So Matt.
Thanks, Nicole. Good afternoon, everybody. Matt Kaufman, Deputy Director with the Health Department. I think one of the things that we just want to make sure that the community and the Oversight Committee understands is really the soil sample results are sort of the first piece. But the second and probably more intense work is taking the numerical values that we get from the lab and validating them. And there's a whole quality process that needs to take place to make sure that the numbers that we're getting from the lab are indeed what we would likely find in the samples based on the lab's performance. And when I say performance, it's looking and making sure that the lab is giving us results that really are valid. And there's a number of ways that we do that. And I'm sure TRC, Jonathan, and maybe Laura could speak to those if the community has questions. But really, we want to make sure that the lab, that the results that they're providing us are valid. And then the next part of the work that they're going to be doing, which is probably the most important work, is taking those numerical values of the different amounts of lead, other metals that were found in the sample, and putting those into a risk assessment model. And what I would say is crunching the numbers and looking at those and comparing those values to benchmark standards that are established, as well as background levels that we would expect to find for these different metals here in California. So I know we've been sort of talking about the sample results, when we're going to get the sample results back. And really, it's not necessarily the sample results that we're looking for. It's really taking those sample results, validating them, and then putting them into the risk assessment model and getting a report from TRC to really explain to us what all of these numbers mean in terms of the health impacts that may have resulted from this release. So I think over the next 2 weeks or so, I think TRC is going to be doing quite a bit of work because they're going to be validating those results from the lab and then running their risk assessment models. And then I think we're still on target. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan. We're still on target for the end of May, early June to have a report out of what the numbers actually mean and in terms of health risk. Is that right, Jonathan? I just want to confirm with you.
Yeah, we'll have preliminary results in that time frame, or
Okay.
late May, early June. I don't think it'll be a final report because we obviously want to incorporate the input that we get from the county once we communicate what we're doing. And then on one other comment, in terms of validating the data, just to give you an idea of what that entails, a typical lab report and the labs we go to, by the way, are state accredited to do this kind of work. They are required to go through certain quality control checks at the lab to determine, like, maybe they've run a sample from another site previous to this. They need to make sure they've adequately prepared the instrument for this analysis. What they do is, in some cases, they will spike, with a known quantity of a certain chemical, and then analyze it to make sure that it comes out within a certain percent of what they expect it to be. And so these are routine quality checks that are conducted by the lab. So we don't just take the result that is tabulated, but we look a little deeper to make sure that we understand were these data going to be reliable for the ongoing evaluations. And so that's the step that we're at right now. And then the risk assessment we've gone over before about what that entails. We're looking at thresholds published by the US EPA and the Cal EPA, as you stated, and we'll compare those thresholds with the levels that we have for ingestion, dermal contact, inhalation of particulates, and then a separate modeling will need to be done to determine the potential route of ingestion of fruits and vegetables through plant uptake. And that part needs to be modeled. That's not off the shelf, if you will. So it is kind of a high-level summary of what we're doing right now and expect to have complete by late May, early June.
Thank you, Jonathan. And, Jonathan brings up a good point, and I just want to remind everybody about what the typical oversight committee process is for this. So when we talk about having that preliminary report, yes, that report will be presented to the oversight committee through a meeting just like this. The oversight committee will have the opportunity to make their comments. We will still have the same public comment period. Then TRC will need to go back and incorporate any comments from that meeting. The next part of that process, though, is there will be a 45-day public comment period, which will include a separate public meeting where members of the community will be able to, put their input in, submit comments to us in writing, and each one of those comments will need to be addressed. And so I wanted to make sure that, everyone kind of understood that there's a couple of next steps before we get to final report, but just because we're not calling it a final report doesn't mean that, we're not going to be able to provide insider answers. And I think at that time too, TRC will let us know if they feel if any additional sampling needs to occur as a result of their risk assessment. So before we move on, I did see that Kent has his hand raised, so I wanted to address Kent's comment. So Kent, go ahead. He might have had to sign back on. Let me see if I need to re-promote him. Sorry. Okay, Kent, you're back online with us. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Okay, I had a couple questions. One of the questions is sample 14 looked like it was still inside the plume model. And one of the things that a few of us had expressed was an interest in getting a sample that was outside of the plume model. Specifically and anecdotally, MRC is using the plume model as sort of an absolute guide of who they're willing to consider source of claims. And so we wanted something outside of that so that then we could say, like, look, the plume model is a guesstimate, not an absolute scientific instrument. And so I'm wondering, was that actually technically out of the plume model, or was it in the plume model?
So I think Adam can speak best to that, but my understanding is that it was outside.
Okay.
It's really
That was the
hard
right
to
answer.
tell. I'll just, so there are no lines, right? The plume model is just a guide. There is no line to cross to say it's there, this area is impacted versus this area.
Mhm.
Nor is this sampling event going to say that this house was and this house wasn't. So for us to determine that and to get into what MRC is saying that who's impacted, I don't think we want to necessarily go in that direction at this point in time. But if we're just talking about, was that sample location in the white area? From my map, I've zoomed in and out, and it appears that it is, because it's behind the refinery itself, right next to Los Juntos. But I would have to look again at maybe a different model to see if Air Quality Management District has a better map to see down to street level, because at this point it's kind of hard to tell. Originally, we discussed whether or not to pull a sample in the white area as a background, and we decided the risk assessment is more about assessing the risk on all the areas, and we're going to do a risk assessment on all those samples. It's not necessary to prove it's here or isn't here.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the second question I had is really directed towards TRC, since they are the experts in this regard. There is a discussion about measuring hexavalent chromium. And my understanding is that hexavalent chromium is unstable, which means that over time it actually breaks down and becomes less hexavalent. And so doing these samples in May, when the event happened 6 months prior, are we actually going to see a legitimate amount of incident hexavalent chromium, or will it have completely broken down at this point?
Nicole, do you want us to take that?
I think that you guys would be the experts.
I'm not able to provide an answer, so if you're able to provide an answer, yes, please go ahead.
Well, I will also ask Laura to chime in, but yes, you're correct. Hexavalent chromium is less stable than trivalent chrome, which is far more common in the environment. We added hexavalent chromium because, well, it wasn't part of the initial suite, but the analytical scope selected for this investigation was entirely dependent on the results of sampling for the catalyst dust that was obtained by the county shortly after the distribution, if you will. So I don't know that hexavalent chrome was included in the analytical suite for back in November, December, when the samples were collected, but we added it just as a point of being conservative. I can't really give you're correct that hexavalent chrome is less stable in the environment, but as to the time frame of months to years for transitions from one oxidation state to another, I can't really speak to that. We're just doing the best we can here in May, early May, and your point's well taken. Laura Trezzolo may have some more insight on that, which I would welcome.
Okay. Hi. Yeah, one thing to add, when we look at our risk evaluation for a resident, we're actually looking at somebody who is exposed to this particular soil concentration for up to 26 years. So we're not just looking at an acute threat, but we're looking at a very long-term threat or a long-term risk. So, and as Jonathan mentioned, we're working with the information that we have, and we're again the long-term health effects or risk would be, maybe that hexavalent chromium would further, transform into other forms of chromium over time. But what we're capturing is what's happening at the moment, when they collected the soil data. But that will be, again, that will be the snapshot that they will be exposed to for the next 26 years. So just to add some value to what Jonathan mentioned.
Great. Thank you, both Jonathan and Laura. I did want to just see, Ken, I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit more about the claims process to address some of Kent's comments from his first question. Or if you can speak a little bit more to the claims process as to who can submit a claim.
Yeah, that wouldn't be me that could speak to the claims process.
Okay, understood. Thank you, Ken.
And this is Matt. This is Matt Kaufman with the Health Department. I think we've gotten several questions regarding the claims process. I was wondering, and maybe you need to take this back to your team, but I think if you're willing to bring somebody that is knowledgeable to the claims process, we can certainly put you on an agenda, a future agenda, so that I think we can get information out there regarding your claims process, what would be considered, quote, a valid claim, because I think that was sort of Kent's maybe question about who would be open to submitting a claim, who would be considered a valid claim. I think, the health department has actually gotten quite a few questions on this. So I think maybe putting you on a future agenda, if you're open to it, we would be open to that.
There may be someone on the call in the public that can speak to that.
Oh, okay.
Who would that be, Ken, so I can promote them?
I can't see who is on.
Okay, the only other name that I recognize is Nam Van. Would he be able to?
That's legal. I don't know if he would be the best. I was thinking if Brandon Matson was on.
I don't see Brandon on.
Okay. Yeah, so we could do that on a future agenda item.
Okay, I will make a note of that.
Okay.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay, I'm not seeing any additional hands raised or hearing comments from additional members of the Oversight Committee. So then next on our agenda item would be to open it up for the 2-minute public comment period. So Kayla, I think we have at least one hand raised right now. Just a reminder, everyone will have 2 minutes to speak, and please raise your hand and we will go in order of hands raised for public comment. So Kayla, if we want to start with Courtney.
Okay, Courtney, go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Courtney Masella O'Brien. I am a trustee on the school board of Martinez Unified. And we recently formed a committee within our school board, an ad hoc committee, to discuss some of these issues with the community and MRC. So I'm happy to be here today. We did also recently learn that there was the spent catalyst was found at the junior high school in Martinez. I'm happy to see that you added the testing site at Las Juntas Elementary. I would like to point out, however, that there are actually 6 Martinez Unified schools within 1.5 miles of this refinery. I know our board and our community members, teachers, parents are very concerned about student safety. We'd really like to have further discussions and look at having all of the school sites tested as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other public comments today? Okay, I see Heidi has her hand raised, but before that, I'm wondering, Laura, can you, to address, kind of the comments we just heard from Courtney, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the risk assessment and, what the whole rationale was behind, getting these 14 sample points and how cumulatively they're going to be looked at to assess risk at a wider level.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, our goal was to evaluate soil and a worst case condition. And that includes, when we look at a resident, 6 years of a resident who is a child. And then in the risk assessment world, as you become a 7-year-old, you go from certain child, assumptions into adults. So, but it's a total of about a 26-year exposure duration. So that is, I think, an umbrella of a worst case scenario for children in general, whether they're at home or at school. So I want to say that the approach that we are following is consistent with the way DTSC and US EPA evaluates our most, our younger receptors that might be a little bit more sensitive. So I guess I would just say that we're going to continue to follow this approach, and hoping that when we get our results, again, we're still in the preliminary phase, so we don't really have anything to share yet, but we will certainly be able to address more specific questions as we come up with our results.
Okay, and then also to clarify, Laura, because I think there's some confusion, while there was 14 soil samples taken, it's not that you're going to say, okay, here's MRC1 compared to, the screening levels. It's the cumulative risk from all of the soil that we've taken, right? That represents these areas of the county where we feel it was affected and there could be potential health impacts.
The cumulative risk piece, we're going to look at risk at every single sample location, and we're going to actually look at all of the analytes that we evaluated, and then we're going to combine the risks from those analytes into one, what I would say, we call it cumulative risk. So it would be the risk from every single analyte for each soil sample. So we will have a total of 14 different risk values. I would not say that we take those and then combine them together. That's not the technically traditional way to do that. But within each sample, we're looking at, in that map, the sort of the darkest blues that would have hypothetically the highest deposition, highest contribution coming from that catalyst dust, and we were trying to capture those locations, and then looking at that from a receptor who is a resident. Let's say a resident was living right there, and they were living there and ingesting that soil we look at it 350 days a year for 26 years. So that's if you think about that, that's a pretty conservative approach in the way we're addressing risk. We're looking at it not just for, a short term, we're looking at children and adults, and we're combining that all into each soil sample will have a cumulative risk value assigned to it based on the concentrations that were presented in that sample. I hope that makes sense.
Understood. It does. And so that will be able to give us insight into the potential health impacts or risks that, any one individual, like say myself, would see from my home in Martinez versus my work office in Martinez, or a child at home versus a child at school or playing over in, one of the parks for Martinez or other affected cities and areas. Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you. Okay, so next I see we have Heidi Taylor. So we'll go to Heidi and then Teresa and then Kathy.
Okay, Heidi, go ahead when you're ready.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Courtney, for coming to the Oversight Committee. I think what's missing from the Oversight Committee is the perspective from the Martinez Unified School District. And so I would like to urge the powers that be to include yet another seat for a member from the school board. I think their perspective on what's happened is very important. And I will follow up with the ISO meeting, but I would like that taken back and considered by whoever has the power to add yet another seat. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then just as a reminder, the appointment of community members was done by Supervisor Glover. So I'm going to let Matt speak to that because I think he will be able to provide some insight as to.
Thank you, Heidi, for that comment. What I will do is I will touch base with Supervisor Federal Glover, who made the appointments of the community members, and speak with him regarding your request.
Great, thank you. So we'll move next to Teresa and then Kathy.
Okay. Teresa, go ahead when you're ready.
Hello, and thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. I appreciate all this information, and I've been sitting in since the last meeting on 4/27. And during that meeting, I did reach out to both Nicole and Michael Kent in regards to additional concerns for the Mount View neighborhood. And I was told that a testing sample would be completed in that neighborhood, as I've tested my own soil and I have high amount of metals found. I do not see that happening. And that was agreed upon, I believe, in that last meeting on 4/27. So I'd like to know why that neighborhood, which is the closest to the refinery, is not considered or being tested for our community. That is a major concern for me.
Yeah, so I just, want to reiterate that the vote was to add an additional sampling points in between that part of Martinez 1 and MRC 1 and MRC 5 that was initially determined by TRC in their sampling location and sampling work plan. And the intent of doing that was to be able to provide sampling in those areas that we felt were not covered. And I think, Adam had described kind of, the whole rationale behind choosing public locations versus residential homes. So we did try and get as close to areas as possible, but we were keeping to public spaces. Let's see, next we have Kathy, and then Cheryl, I'll go to you after Kathy.
Okay, Kathy, go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Oh, no. Oh.
We can hear you, Kathy.
Oh, okay. Where was I? Oh, I appreciated what Lauren has just spoken to, Tozzolo. I think my perspective about the school sampling is that you have a mass of people all congregated onto one area. Just from my own experience, I know at Morella Park, the kids do play on the grass that's that park. That park is associated with the community just around and opposite. And how does the mass of a certain area get fit into the view, the perspective of the sampling plan that's already being done now? Would seem to me that would change, possibly change, alter how it would interpret facts. As if you had thousands of people over a long period of time, 26 years, playing in a certain area, you have a much bigger risk in those concentrated mass areas. Thank you.
Nicole, do you want me to respond to that?
Yes, please. And then
Okay.
Laura, too, if you also want to address maybe a little bit the previous commenters' concerns about this Mountain View area and the kind of the soil sampling points we've identified as new in there and how that plays into the risk assessment as well.
Sure. Okay. So
Thank you.
to answer the question about the number of people, I think is what you were wondering about. If there's, one person who might be exposed versus multiple people or thousands of people because they're in a public park. What we do is we're looking at the very, assuming that somebody was actually living at that park and that they were present there, and every day as a child, they would go out and play. And in doing so, they're ingesting, incidentally, like they're playing in the mud, they get mud on their hands or they get dirt on their hands, and then they kind of like incidentally, eat it or put it up to their mouth. And that's 350 days a year for, an entire 26-year duration. So the number of people who might be in a specific area it doesn't really have any sort of play into the risk that we're evaluating. We're evaluating, or we plan to evaluate the soil concentrations and the risks as though somebody is actually living there and present at that site every single day, except for, they say 350 days. So they assume 2 weeks of the year that you are not at your home. And that's the most conservative approach in looking at soil like this, when you have multiple, areas and people who might be exposed and how are they exposed. In doing so, this way, we're looking, again, we kind of keep saying it over and over, but a very worst case scenario. And that kind of plays into the question about maybe locales that didn't get soil sampled. Again, we go back to the modeling approach and the modeling results, and we're assuming that if we have one soil sample that is collected in maybe, what we would assume, maybe there was observed catalyst dust and they were also predicted, that would be likely the very worst case of soil conditions from the catalyst dust depositing on the soil. So we're really, again, this is sort of our preliminary sampling approach. So we're looking worst case. If our risks come back and we need to do more sampling, we will do that.
Thank you, Laura. Cheryl, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Couple of things. As a Mountain View representative, I just wanted to tell Teresa that when we were trying to determine as many tests as we could get done, we kind of went to the outer limits of the area into Vine Hill, because we weren't going to be adding lots of extra tests in between downtown and Vine Hill. But what these tests should show us is if we need to do additional testing for Mountain View and how far that testing would go. That's my presumption anyway, for a Mountain View assessment. I had a question, and I know we talked about we were talking about the cumulative evaluations to determine risk values. And I hope what we're not saying is averaging them together. Cumulative, I'm not really sure how that works. And I'm sure somebody can explain it to us. And I know when Kathy was talking about the number of people affected on site, and I think what the answer is we're not looking at the number of people, but you can equate, say, the number of hours that a child spends at school with the number of hours that they likely spend at home. So that makes them equal, and all things being equal, the schools and the residences would be honored the same way. I think that's what was said. So anyway, but my one question was about cumulative evaluations.
Right. Okay. Sorry, Nicole, you tell me if you want me to answer.
Yes, please, Laura. No, you're the subject matter expert on this. I think you are best positioned to answer.
Okay, sure. So when I say cumulative, all I'm saying is at MRC 1, we got soil data back, and we will address all the exposure pathways and come up with a risk number for arsenic or for hexavalent chromium, for all of these chemicals that we've analyzed for. And then we just add all those chemicals, the chemical risks together. And that sum is the cumulative risk for that particular sample. So we're doing like a mini risk assessment for that one sample. And we will do that individually for each soil location. We aren't going to average anything. We're looking worst case. So we're only collecting information that's, the risk is based on the soil concentration itself. But again, the cumulative part is where we're adding in all the different exposure pathways, and in addition, the chemicals themselves. So we're adding the risk from all the chemicals in the sample and across all the pathways that a resident could be exposed, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And I know Jonathan stated this earlier, but would you mind just restating the pathways that we're going to evaluate again for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking specifically at incidental ingestion of soil and dermal contact with soil, inhalation of soil particulates that's due to wind blowing kicks up some of the soil particulates into the air. We're looking at, we're also going to be looking at whether or not any of this may potentially impact groundwater. So there's a leaching component to that, but that's a separate, it's a little bit confusing, but that's more of a fate and transport. So we're worried about the groundwater, just to make sure that we're going to evaluate that. We're also looking at, obviously, the biggest concern is the ingestion of homegrown produce. So we're going to be doing some modeling of soil uptake through the roots of plants into the plants themselves, and then ingestion of the potential, the fruits or the vegetables of those plants. And there's also, we're looking at an ecological component. So that's the human health side. And then we're also going to look at an eco side. So the human health, these pathways will be adding together. And then on the eco side, that's a more of a screening approach. So yeah, but I think the biggest concerns are in ingesting the soil, coming into direct contact with the soil, and then the ingestion of the homegrown produce. And those will absolutely be part of our risk evaluation.
So
Thank you, Laura.
I just have one thing to add, really. I think, just to summarize again, it's cumulative across all the constituents, all the metals that we analyze, and all the pathways of exposure. And what's built in here is very conservative assumptions about how many milligrams a day of soil for 350 days a year one is ingesting, and how much exposure over your surface area of your skin, and how much breathing rate you have to draw in particulates. So these are, just want to emphasize that there are a lot of conservative assumptions associated with this this risk assessment at a given point, and then it's that is carried cumulatively across across all constituents and all exposure pathways, as Laura's so accurately stated.
Thank you, Jonathan. Tom, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just a quick question regarding this cumulative exposure over 25 years. So the models assume that at the beginning of that 25-year time count, the concentrations of these different metals remain constant, or do the models build in like some sort of chemical change?
The simple answer is that the concentration is static. It is the same. It does not change. We don't incorporate any degradation.
And is there any evidence? What is the evidence that generally supports that? Or is there a general chemical principle that they're heavy metals and they just stay in the soil? Or
this is a common method that we use in risk assessment. We assume that no biodegradation, no degradation is occurring. Therefore, in general, everything we do is to add a level of conservatism into it, so that we feel very confident that when we show there isn't a risk, that there really isn't a risk. Therefore, like I said, that's a traditional approach that US EPA, when they started crafting how to basically do risk assessments, this was one of their assumptions. The concentration term remains static, remains constant.
Nicole, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I don't see any additional oversight committee members with their hands raised, but I do see a comment from the attendees. So Kayla, we can let Michael Kent speak.
Okay, Michael, you should be able to come off mute.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I think a little bit more explanation is needed to address both the question that came up from Courtney, from the school board member, and also from Teresa from Mountain View. And I think it's important to be able to explain to people why in a first pass like this, the 14 samples that were chosen, over quite a wide area are adequate for a first sampling, even though they don't, take a sample from every location, every neighborhood, every school, everyone's yard. So if I understand where Mountain View is, the neighborhood sort of between downtown and 680, why is the sampling regime done there adequate, at least on this first round of sampling, to say that that represents what's in Mountain View? Also, similarly, why are the samples chosen adequate to represent what might be found at the various school sites? I think it's important for people to understand that, so they're not worried that if their yard or their school or their neighborhood wasn't sampled, that doesn't mean this risk assessment doesn't address the risk to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Laura, are you able to address that?
Yes, absolutely. Knowing that this is such a critical piece, I understand that it will certainly make folks anxious if they didn't have a sample located or sample collected in their town or in their, near their home or their work. But again, this approach was conducted so that we could expedite the risk evaluation process. And also the costs involved with doing, if we had collected 8,000 samples, it would have taken much longer and would have been a much more, cumbersome. But in this approach, if we do see risk in a specific area, we would expand that in that area so we can get a better refinement on what we're, what we might be collecting or what we could collect in maybe some areas that we initially missed. But I agree, risk communication is so important. And certainly we will address that once we get put our findings together, and understanding that again, we can work on some of those kind of basic communication, risk communication points.
I'm wondering too, if we can just, kind of address and discuss the whole concept behind a worst case scenario, because I think part of what's pulling this all together is that in partnering with the area district to find areas where we expect a deposition, we can feel, and please, Jonathan or Laura, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that this is helping us to feel confident that we know where there are areas of deposition, and we've been able to identify where we believe there's areas of greater or less deposition. And we have now conducted sampling in areas where there has been deposition of some sort of the catalyst. And so this can really be reflective of what was seen, because we feel confident that where we are sampling, catalyst fell down. We weren't going into this blind, so we didn't have to take, for example, 100 samples to know that we were going to hit areas where the catalyst had fallen. I mean, right, the worst case scenario would be just, the catalyst dust itself, and now we're looking at catalyst dust that has gotten onto soil in specific areas identified. I think maybe it's what we're trying to get at is just the explanation of this whole worst case scenario.
Right, and what may emerge from this is, a better understanding of the pattern of deposition. Even this catalyst dust did not fall like rain over a uniform area and a uniform. Not that rain falls necessarily in a uniform strength, if you will, or intensity at a given area. But this is our first cut, if you will. It's a screening level approach, and we may learn that we have areas of risk pockets, if you will, where there's more concern than in other areas based on how it all aerially deposited. So again, it's a screening level approach, and we're not taking samples in areas where we think minimal to no deposition would have occurred, and yet we'll see what we get. If we see an area where risks are higher, then that may warrant a second phase where we go in and we zero in on that area.
Thank you. Tony, I just got you promoted to panelist, and I think you had a question as well. So if you wanted to bring anything forward, please go ahead.
No, right now, thank you. Right now, my question was answered, so I'm good.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Okay, I'm going to do a last call for public comment period. If anyone who hasn't spoken already wanted to make a comment, please raise your hand. Otherwise, we will move to the roundtable session. Okay, I'm not seeing any additional hands raised from the public. So now I will open it up to the roundtable session on our agenda, which is really just if anyone from the Oversight Committee has anything additional that they want to bring forward to our attention, now would be the time. Otherwise, if there's nothing else, we will end the meeting. I did say this at the beginning of the meeting, but I just wanted to re-emphasize that we do now have a place where people can go and provide their emails and sign up for more information to follow along as the Oversight Committee does their work. So, please visit the website in the chat and sign up if you're interested in joining that list. Okay, I'm not seeing anything from any of our Oversight Committee members. So I will do a last call just in case anyone was trying to talk and was on mute or didn't get their hand raised. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, then that concludes the Oversight Committee meeting. We will be having an additional meeting early in June once we have these this preliminary draft report available to share with the Oversight Committee. I think we're tentatively looking at June 8th, but everyone please stay tuned for that. Oh, Cheryl, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, did we ever determine a regular date for meeting?
We did determine a regular date for meetings. However, what was chosen was the third Thursday of every month, and I do not want to wait that long for our next meeting. If we have results, we want to get that out to the community as quick as possible. So we might have a one-off meeting, but traditionally, yes, these meetings will be held every third Thursday at 2 p.m.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Tony, go ahead. Tony, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Okay. I did want to ask the question. I've heard a number of people say that they had samples taken and they had testing done of that sample. I was just wondering if those tests were done by a certified lab, are you asking those people to turn that information into County Health Services, at least as a background, or you can look at the lab that was done? I asked this because at a CAP meeting, MRC CAP meeting, Bob Baker, who lives close to the refinery, had soil samples done and tested. And he stated at the CAP meeting that he was going to turn that information into the county. I don't know if he did or not. I was just wondering if any of that information that community members have done on their own through a certified lab is any value.
So Tony, I can say that I personally have not heard of anything, but the county at this time is not requesting that information.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't see any other hands raised from Oversight Community members, so we will be ending our meeting. Thank you very much, everybody. Again, please be on the lookout for the next meeting, which is tentatively set for June 8th. You can always find more information on our website or get yourself on our email list to be notified of additional information. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.